category I wanted to kind of chat about. I mean, a lot of people who read the paper see the people who cover the news as being the ones on the front line. There's a lot of others behind them, the editorialists, columnists, cartoonists, and so on. Is there anyone else that comes to mind from that broader sphere of journalism, from being an editor, an executive editor, a columnist, a cartoonist, that in their own right is arguably should be legendary in Delaware?
Besides John and me?
Yeah. I think, at least in my experience at the News Journal, Fred Hartman, who had the good fortune or the misfortune to hire me, he was a very, very good city editor and later executive editor. He worked with Harry, he worked with me, he worked with Sam, and a whole host of other people. He was just a top-flight newsman. And he just retired last year as the executive editor in Jacksonville, Florida. But I think he's one. Before then, there were some others who I am told were good editors. You might ask Harry Thiel to mention.
Maybe
there was
during the Q&A
Henry Kloss, who ran the News Journal. I mean, there were a number of people there that I knew about.
Incidentally, for our audience, we do have a microphone over here to my left, to your right, and at some point we're going to ask you if you have any questions to please feel free to raise them. And Harry or Frank or any of the rest of you who are familiar with some of the legends that we've talked about, you may want to add on that or may want to ask questions. Tammy, any others?
Well, I guess a contemporary who some of you would know and I think was a very good and is a very good journalist and still practicing would be Judith Rolls, who was probably one of the few very strong female reporters at her time with the Delaware State News when she was reporting, and then later I think she did have some editing responsibilities. She was publisher in the late 80s, early 90s. She was my predecessor, and she's now at the St. Petersburg Times. And is involved in a lot of national journalistic issues. So I think that she certainly is someone who became quite an expert on the environmental issues and probably led a lot of that reporting in Delaware.
Well, the last kind of question I want to ask in this series of kind of kicking off today's discussion actually goes to, in some ways, the category you're just getting to with that. I call them Delaware's exported journalists. That is, people who rightfully Delaware has a claim on. They either grew up here, went to school here, started their careers here, but moved on to become quite influential outside of our state. A couple of obvious names that had occurred to me as I got ready were Joe Pine, and that is one that goes back roughly a half century, who conducted one of the first ever radio talk shows in Wilmington at WILM, and I've forgotten the year, John, you may remember, 50s and early 60s?
I remember it, I was a kid, in the early 50s.
Yeah, and the other is
Your
Tom.
mother wears combat boots.
Yeah.
One of his famous things.
And Tom Meese, who started here and went on to some fame with ESPN in its early days before he died tragically at a fairly young age just a couple of years ago. Any other names that kind of come to mind?
Well, from our shop, I'm Curtis Wilkie, who went on to cover the White House for the Boston Globe. Haynes Johnson started his career in Wilmington, now a premier writer for the Washington Post. Phil Boffey, who is the deputy editorial page editor of the New York Times, worked at the News Journal early in his career. There's three that I can think of.
What about Joe Trento, who we were talking about?
I was going to say Joe Trento, certainly I think is...
My Lord Joe.
Yeah. Joe Trento was a fellow who, in the newsroom, we always joked, covered CIA and the town of Ellesmere.
That's right.
In the News Journal, the whole thing was structured on beats, as most newsrooms are, and everyone had a beat, and Joe had aspirations far beyond the News Journal, and so he was constantly working on stories on the CIA, but on Tuesday nights he had to go cover the Ellesmere Town Council. So.
Well, I mentioned Judith. I guess another that I would mention who was with us for a couple of years would be Chip Scanlon, Christopher Scanlon, who went on to the Providence paper and also worked down at the St. Petersburg Times, and now is the director of the writing program at the Poynter Institute, which many of you probably aren't familiar with unless you're interested in journalism.
My bag.
Oh, that's your bag over there. But the Poynter Institute is a special place for people who want to go and really learn about cutting-edge journalism issues and also just how to write well and how to report well.
Okay. Good warm-up as we get into this. The next series of questions that I wanted to kind of pose to you, think about, kind of maybe elevate the provocativeness of it. I want to talk about the role of changing ownership in Delaware's journalism, competition to our homegrown media from outside of Delaware, the lack of enough commercial base, the impact of our state's small size on things like radio and TV, changing listener and reader patterns, the role of the DuPont family, which certainly in this century back, I don't know how much of our audience knows it, and John may remember it. I think there was of course, the DuPont family had owned the News Journal at one point through Christiana Securities, but there was a point where different branches of the DuPont family owned the Morning News and Evening Journal and used it in a shooting war, a family feud. You know, a little bit about the News Journal Delaware State News rivalry, which really has been more quiet, but which at one point was something that we talked about. Upstate, downstate issues and the role of the weekly press. Let's kind of go back and start by, you know, probably two of the most profound events have been the Gannett's takeover of the News Journal in 1978, the Gannettization of the paper, and also really the changes in the structural ownership of the Delaware State News. You want to?
Okay.
I don't know what that means, Gannettization of the News Journal. I was there under the DuPonts, there under Gannett. Corporate owners have certain goals. You know, I was in the editorial pages when the Gannett Corporation bought the News Journal. My life didn't change very much. You know, they bought the property because they thought it would be profitable for them. Yeah, sure, they have a certain style, and over time that evolves. But they don't tell me who to endorse or what things to write about. Never have. You know, the DuPonts never did directly.
Yeah. Any anecdotal stories about the days when the DuPonts had the paper separate and used them in the shooting wars?
Well, you know, that was back in the 20s, even before my time. Alfred I. DuPont, I think, owned the Morning News, and one of his cousins, I forget which one, owned the Journal every evening, I guess it was. And I mean, they were taking pot shots at each other over a lot of issues, while they were also struggling over control of the company. Alfred was fighting with his cousins, Coleman and Pierre. Finally, and then there were some private scandals. And finally, they bought him out, and he went off to Florida to do other things.
Yeah. Tammy?
We'll talk about independent newspapers?
Sure.
Okay. What Sam mentioned, the ownership. Our company, Independent Newspapers, owns the Delaware State News, and a few years ago, our company also purchased several other newspapers, and that kind of gets into maybe the upstate-downstate split too, because we've concentrated on growing our coverage area, if you will, and filling in, so to speak, with additional weekly newspapers in places like Milford, the Milford Chronicle, the Leader and State Register in Seaford, the Harrington Journal, the Sussex Post in Central Sussex. We also have papers on the Eastern Shore in Maryland. But our ownership structure is very, very different from Gannett. Gannett is a huge, huge international corporation that, and I don't think there's any secret to the fact that it's also obviously, because it's publicly held, there's a certain requirement and need to generate healthy profits and pay dividends to stockholders. Our company has remained, in comparison certainly, in a state as small as Delaware, very small. And while we were originally owned by a single man, Jack Smith, who we didn't mention earlier, but he was the individual who founded the Delaware State News as a daily, and he and his son went on and developed other publications as well. That company is now held by a not-for-profit trust that, it's kind of the overarching company that owns the operating and for-profit portion of our company. So it's a very different structure in terms of how we handle profits. We don't pay dividends. All the money is put back into all of the local publications. And I don't think there's an either or. I don't think there's a right or wrong, but it's a very different approach to ownership. It is.
It's a unique approach in my experience in journalism, and my impression is that one of the things that approach assures, Tammy, is that really the Delaware State News and the other properties of Independent Newspapers, Inc. will remain independent really for our lifetime.
Well, quite honestly, one of the reasons that we started with that structure a few years ago was because of the belief that it's really important to have independent voices in the community, particularly at a time when large corporations, sometimes corporations that don't have anything to do with news or journalism, are buying up properties, when I say properties, newspapers or media outlets all over the country. And we've seen a lot of interesting things that have happened with the places like the Los Angeles Times, and certainly with Disney getting into the news business for a while. And we kind of set out to come up with an ownership structure that would maintain that independence, would say, well, this is not a company that is for sale. This is not a company that would ever be sold to a corporation.
I mentioned that Gannett acquired the News Journal in 1978. When did the Independent Newspaper / Delaware State News make its structural change?
I'm going to say about 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But the St. Petersburg Times is
actually, yeah, and the folks
Day in New London, Connecticut.
Yeah, the folks at the St. Petersburg Times advised us on this, and in fact, some of their Andy Barnes, their editor, and some other folks down there have also sat on what we call our big board. We have a board that does not get into our operating decisions, but they meet annually, and their sole purpose is to review what we do in all areas, financially, but also in how we fulfill our mission to ensure that we're staying true to it. And they're people from all over, from some real legends. Actually, Ben Bagdikian is one who was the guy who released the Pentagon Papers for the Washington Post.
And I might point out, it may be difficult and may never happen, but you can never say never, even with a foundation, because the way the structure is, if someone wants it badly enough and is willing to pay enough money, that board has a fiduciary responsibility to the trust that can make it difficult to turn down an offer.
But they don't have that decision-making authority, actually.
Let's